Welcome, everybody, to Facts on the Ground podcast. This is episode number 9, and I am pleased to announce two new developments, if you will. The first is that I've been joined by my co-host, Misty Winston, and she is going to be my co-host for the rest of the series, as long as we keep going. And I'm very pleased to have on journalist, writer, and filmmaker Dan Cohen. He has contributed to The Gray Zone. He formerly worked at RT America, and he also co-produced the film Killing Gaza with journalist Max Blumenthal. So, Dan, thank you very much for coming on and joining us today.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Of course. So I want to start, with the topic of the day, I guess you will, the quote-unquote official annexation of the West Bank that is coming under the Trump-Kushner peace plan. Can you speak to that? Like, what has happened today with regard to that so far?
Well, I mean, if you read the New York Times, actually the big news of the day is Hong Kong. Is China applying a national security law inside of its own borders. I don't think anyone in Washington actually cares that Israel is stealing a huge amount of more Palestinian land, officially stealing it. But the annexation plan that has been rolled out by the Netanyahu government is actually kind of delayed for the day. The Israeli government is woefully underprepared to even implement its own zany plans, and so they've said that it's going to be next week or maybe the week after. So there's not even any huge news on the plan today, but I mean it's just a blatant land theft, and which has basically been the case. If you've ever been to Israel and the West Bank, you can't really tell when you enter occupied territory versus, what's considered legitimate Israel. There's no separation. The green line that was established in 1967 is it only exists, in some maps.
Right.
And so this, annexation plan is really just going from de jure to de facto. I mean, Israel has been settling, of course, colonizing the West Bank since 1967, basically, shortly after it conquered it. And well, it was, basically just a couple of tens of very ideologically extreme settlers at that point. It's gone to this, massive institution where the state, funds these massive, enormous settlements that are like giant suburbs, and it's all done very strategically in order to prevent the possibility of a Palestinian state. And so if and when this annexation plan does go into effect, it will basically leave the major Palestinian population centers as these kind of isolated islands where Palestinians don't have any kind of sovereignty. There is a puppet pseudo government, I suppose you could call it, a civil authority, the Palestinian Authority, which is responsible for civil control but has no actual power and is completely dependent on Israel and the United States. And so I think actually one of the consequences of this annexation plan is it really puts the Palestinian Authority, for one thing, in a tight spot because, it's the Palestinian Authority has said, at least it kind of posited itself as, it gave Palestinians some kind of representation, even though it's widely hated in the West Bank.
Right.
And now it's just been totally embarrassed and discredited. I mean, just humiliated in front of the world. And so there's been these like threats from Mahmoud Abbas and these top PA officials to say, oh, we're going to stop collaborating with Israel with what they call security coordination, where instead of Israel going into refugee camps and stamping out any kind of resistance and imprisoning Palestinians who would consider resisting Israel, whether that's through armed or unarmed means. The Palestinian Authority does it, and actually is often its prisons are notoriously brutal, often more so than even Israeli prisons.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not clear, on the ground, what does this actually change if and when this annexation plan actually goes through. I don't see that there's going to be an enormous kind of change. It's more, I think, one of the ways to look at it is kind of in Israeli society. What does it mean to go from, what a few decades ago was, well, I guess 50 years ago now, was just a couple of, zealots to, taking over by the entire, now the government wants to annex. I think it speaks to the extreme right-wing shift that Israel has gone under, and it's this continual process where, if you say, like, if you were one of the Zionists who, ethnically cleansed 48 Palestine and created Israel, it was kind of, a lot of them weren't really thinking so much about the West Bank, and some of them didn't even want to take it, some did, But the next generation, after they conquered, occupied the West Bank and Gaza Strip, that generation is now used to that. That becomes a standard. It's not like this, faraway place, even though physically, geographically, it's very close. It's like psychologically, Israeli society is now like used to this, and so because it's a colonial, enterprise, it has to keep expanding and expanding and expanding. And so it's kind of reached its limits of where it can expand to. And, it's just the constant right-wing shift in Israel that has just taken over. And there's, like when you look at liberal Zionists like to say that like the occupation is this necessary evil. And this is not really, maybe some people in Tel Aviv think this. It's not, by far not the majority. But, the mainstream thinking in Israel now is not that it's, a necessary evil to protect ourselves from, Palestinian terrorists or Jordan or whatever it is. It's that this is actually righteous, that this isn't bad. This is a good thing.
Right.
That, we're returning to the land of our forefathers and all this stuff. And so, I think that's part of the psychological shift that you see.
So, and to your point, when you said that Israel is woefully ill-prepared to carry out their own plan, I was kind of wondering what your thoughts were on the timing of this, sort of. It seemed that the deal of the century was kind of announced right as Netanyahu was in a lot of trouble. The election was getting ready to come up, and he was looking for some help and, gaining some support. Do you think that had a huge influence on this decision? And do you think that it seems like it's almost a rushed thing, like it's been kind of flipped into high gear very quickly? Do you think that has anything to do with the fact that Netanyahu may be worried that Trump is only going to be a one-term president? What do you think? Like, what do you think the kind of game plan is there? Because it seems like it's all very, like you said, they're not ready for this. It seems like it's just been kind of tossed out there. Do you think that the Netanyahu scandal had anything to do with that?
Well, there's no doubt that the Israelis see the Trump presidency as kind of a, once in a generation sort of opportunity to get their most extreme desires fulfilled, that are politically possible. I mean, of course, they would love to expel every single last Palestinian, but that's, just not really feasible because of geopolitical realities. But with the Trump presidency, I mean, it's like, you know, Christmas Day. I mean, maybe that doesn't really make sense, but like, so there's no doubt that that it's a huge opportunity for them. And yeah, Netanyahu has been, you know, for two plus years has been mired in these mounting scandals that somehow he's kept at bay. And you know, there's basically 4 cases of corruption against him. You know, ranging from a number of things. I mean, actually, to me, the most scandalous one that's not even really talked about is the fact that he had the military buy 7 nuclear weapons capable submarines from this German company, ThyssenKrupp, which was basically one of the backbones of the Nazi war machine that was reconfigured and into NATO years later. But this company now is supplying these submarines to Israel, and the Israeli Defense Ministry had only agreed to buy 3 of them, and all of a sudden Netanyahu has 7, and it turns out his cousin is the representative for this company. And so it's not only, you know, buying the submarines, but it's also these massive contracts worth billions upon billions of dollars to do upkeep of these highly technical submarines that are sitting in salt water.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so they have constant upkeep. So that's like one of his, you know, giant scandals. But, you know, of course, Netanyahu's always playing to the right wing. You know, and he's right wing, you know, himself, but
right.
In Israeli society, he's not considered like extreme or like real right wing by any stretch of the imagination.
He's not like Ayelet Shaked or somebody of her ilk.
And Ayelet Shaked is not even really an ideologically like she's secular, so she doesn't believe in like theocracy and like kingdom of God. She's like kind of a secular like fascist type, but I mean, there are many in government. You could look like Bezalel Smotrich, who's a popular settler lawmaker. Quite a few of them who really believe in full-on theocracy and like genocide of any non-Jews, and Jews have to like live by, you know, these very strict standards. And so these are the people that Netanyahu's kind of surrounded himself with. And for them, actually, annexation is like a compromise. I mean, allowing any Palestinians to stay is really like they don't want to do that. You know, they some of them criticize Netanyahu for agreeing to this at all because they're like, no, we have to get rid of all of them. You know, Ramallah is Israeli land. I mean, there should be, you know, Jews living in Ramallah. I mean, I did live in Ramallah, but so Jews can live there, but like, you know, I'm not a Zionist.
Yeah, exactly. I get what you're saying.
So yeah, I mean, to your point, Misty, there's definitely a moment of opportunity for Netanyahu. It's like, you know, it's saving his ass. But you know, I think at the same time for Netanyahu, he has worked hard to normalize with, in particular, surrounding Arab countries, in the UAE, Saudi Arabia. And I think one of the questions for Netanyahu in this whole annexation process is how does that affect those relationships? Because Israel very much wants normalization, because it helps put the Palestinian issue, they've completely forgotten about it. And they have a common enemy in Iran. All of those countries, the UAE and Saudi Arabia in particular, want to attack Iran, as does Israel. And so, they're forming an alliance. They formed a kind of under the table alliance. It's been there for many years, but it's become more overt in recent years. And so there's kind of a lot of calculations, and of course it makes it, you know, difficult for Israel to. It makes it really difficult for liberal Zionists, which I think is a good thing, actually, because it's not that really different on the ground, but it's like, you know, it's been apartheid for a long time, and you could call it much worse than apartheid. And, Liberal Zionists have been hand-wringing, for decades in the New York Times and the Atlantic, and we can finally say you're full of shit. You can't do this anymore. And there's, so.
That's something else I wanted to ask you about too, actually. The support for Israel has been waning over the past 10, 20 years or so, specifically in the past few years, I mean, for sure. But it seems like you were talking about how Israel has been able to normalize it with surrounding countries. I think they've been able to normalize it throughout the West as well. We see, the anti-Semitic smear campaign that was lobbed against Jeremy Corbyn. Rebecca Long Bailey was just ousted from the Labor Party. It seems like they've done a really good job at narrative management. And I was just wondering kind of what your take on that is, and how you see that affecting, the situation going forward.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, with the EU, UK, US, I mean, there's Israel has, basically total impunity with all of these countries. I think another thing to consider that I should have said before is also what this does with Jordan, because Israel's security coordination, its relationship with Jordan, is really important for Israel. And for Jordan too. Jordan is basically totally dependent on the West, on the goodwill of the U.S., of Israel, of Saudi Arabia also. Mm-hmm. And so it really puts Jordan in a difficult spot. And so doing this can really kind of, change the order. And so it's this kind of Israeli hubris. But I don't think that the US, EU, any of these countries are fundamentally going to change their tune, or there's not going to be any policy change. I mean, Boris Johnson today said he's against annexation. Is Boris Johnson going to do anything against Israel? Not a chance in hell. No. And so I think it's, we're going to see the same thing, that in the West, that you can go out and protest, and we can, look like we have these democratic rights, but it's basically we're like shouting into, a tunnel where it's just there's no response from the political class. Joe Biden says he's not in support of annexation. If he wins, is he going to force Israel to, relinquish that territory? Not a chance in hell. He said he wouldn't move the U.S. embassy back to Tel Aviv. So, I mean,
he's a proud Zionist. He said it openly that he's a proud Zionist. And I think every president, since this all started, has vocally said that they're against the settlements and that they fly against international law. But in practice, they support it militarily, financially. So it's really just more propaganda. They're saying what they're supposed to say and then doing what Israel wants.
Yeah, right. There's so much historical precedent for that too. If you go back and look at the Oslo negotiations when Rabin was prime minister, he was essentially lobbying for, whatever version of peace plan they had at that point. And at the same time, he was increasing Jewish-only colonies in the West Bank. And, it's just so transparently cynical. So it doesn't... I guess that kind of brings me to a question for you, Dan. A lot of people who are sympathetic to Palestinians and what they're going through, what they've gone through since 1948, or even before when they had the strikes in the 30s, they still believe in the two-state solution. And I think if you look at a map of the West Bank, for example, and you look at Area C, which is huge because that's like the biggest swath of completely Israeli-controlled territory, if I'm not mistaken. And but you just look at the way it's been fractured up, and I don't understand why people think there's still a possibility of a two-state solution. So I'm wondering what you think about that. Given that you've been on the ground there and et cetera.
Not only is there no possibility of a two-state solution, because Israel has cut up the West Bank in order to prevent it. And that doesn't even touch the question of, was it ever a just solution, which I would say, of course it's not, because you have millions of refugees, Palestinian refugees, who have their legally guaranteed right to return home. So no, of course there's not going to be any two-state solution. There never was, and Israel's made sure that's not going to happen. I think one of the important things to understand about the two-state solution, hardly anyone in Israel, basically no one, and no one with any kind of political power actually believes in a two-state solution. Mm-hmm. It's just for liberals in the West.
Which is interesting, because we often hear that that's what most Israeli politicians promulgate, the two-state solution. So it's interesting to hear that that's not actually the case. It's just something
you'll hear it from some of the liberal Zionist parties like Meretz, and but they're not. They have basically no political power. So it doesn't. They don't really matter. Right. They gain a few seats in the Knesset every year, and they really don't have any serious power. Who rules Israel and has ruled basically since the starting in the 80s is the settlers. They not only do they have their own parties, but they took over the Likud party. Mm-hmm. The ideological positions of the settler movement, which is that Israel is a holy state, and its wars and its conquests are holy, mm-hmm. and its conquests are irreversible. That is the position of the mainstream Likud, of Benjamin Netanyahu's ruling party. That's not what Benjamin Netanyahu believes, but he's completely surrounded himself with these people,
right?
Because he knows which way the wind blows. He knows he can kind of be the figurehead on this kind of belief system. He's the one who can, work, who can basically get his way with the United States. And you can't have an Israeli prime minister who talks like this, and we just have to kill the Arabs and do this. You can't have that. Like Netanyahu's, he was raised, his formative years were in the United States. He speaks perfect English, American English. Exactly. So he's, the kind of the perfect figurehead for this whole thing. But this idea of a peace process, well, I think, the most important thing, I think, actually, for, us in the West to understand is that the very fiction of a peace process has actually radicalized Israeli society far to the right. Because as the settlers who run the country believe this process of expansion is irreversible. And so if it does reverse, as it did in the Camp David Accords in 1978, when Israel ended up withdrawing from the Egyptian Sinai, that shows that, okay, the state actually is not going to do what it's supposed to do, what God wants, and what it's supposed to do, and we have to do it ourselves. So so after that is slightly before that, actually, is when the settler movement was born, right around there. Basically, it's a process of this. And then it becomes much more extreme. And that's when you have all those a bunch of attempts to actually bomb Al-Aqsa. You have the Al-Aqsa compound. You have a ton of basically terrorist attacks on Palestinians in the 90s when there were the Oslo Accords, which, even though that just set up basically a mechanism to manage the Israeli occupation, the religious right that had grown powerful at that point saw it as a reversal of Israeli sovereignty. So if you're giving Palestinians any sliver of their own power, that's against what can happen. And so what did they do? They assassinated the prime minister, their own prime minister, just for doing that, for creating this phony mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, in 2000, or in 2004, when Ariel Sharon announced the withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, even though this was also another way to just manage the whole thing, because it just basically was like, we got a ton of Palestinians in this tiny little area. Why would we waste so many resources there? This is actually, works well for us. For the Israeli religious Zionists, it's like, no, that is also our land. We have to expel them. And so this, politician who's giving it up, they wanted to kill him too. And there were, death curses on him and all this stuff. So it basically radicalized them.
Settlers being removed from like Gush Katif, for example, and they're like crying their eyes out, and it's like you've been on stolen land the whole time. Exactly. I agree. It was just a management decision, and to anybody who's watching, Jonathan Cook wrote a really good book about this. I think it's his first book. I think it's called Blood and Religion, but it mainly focuses on Israel's withdrawal from Gaza and how it wasn't a humanitarian move, but it was a way to negotiate like the statistical facts on the ground, if you will, to prevent there from being a majority of Arabs and a minority of Jews. I mean, that's a simplified explanation, but I think.
Well, sure.
What do you
Sharon
about that? Because I mean, Jonathan Cook has put that forth, and I think he's a great journalist, and it makes sense. But I would like to hear your take on that.
Well, Ariel Sharon's top aide, Dov Weissglass, said at the time, you can read the interview in Haaretz, that the withdrawal from Gaza basically served two purposes. One, it basically got the Bush administration off the back, because the Bush administration off of the back of the Israeli government, because the Bush administration was pressuring them, to do something, make some kind of agreement. So it was like, look, we, made this overture towards peace, and look what we got. And at the same time, they put those resources into expanding settlements in the West Bank, which is much more obvious, which is much larger and much more resource rich, and now we see the fruit of that today. Dov Weissglass said it put the peace process in formaldehyde, so it totally prevented the establishment of a Palestinian state, and so it basically stopped the peace process. It froze it, and that was the intent, and that's totally clear. I mean, so it was obviously never about peace, and if you look at shortly after the withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, I mean, Gaza's unlivable. I mean, it's been that way for years. It's and this is, and directly as a result, these crises that are in Gaza every day are completely manufactured. It's just purely a result of Israeli occupation and siege, and just, I mean, and the peace process.
Yeah. Quote unquote peace process.
Right.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier too about how no politicians in Israel really believe in the two-state solution, and that it's just kind of something that they talk about. What are your thoughts on the so-called progressive movement in this country? I've noticed that many of them will run on a platform of, Palestinian rights, and then as soon as they're elected, they're walking that back. I think we just recently saw Jamal Bowman do this, where he came out and said that he was against BDS and he believes in a two-state solution. And this seems to be a recurring issue, where we have, this so-called progressive politician who runs on, a pretty strong, I mean, not strong, but a left-ish platform. And then as soon as they're elected, they're walking that back. Do you think that our politicians are also fully aware that a two-state solution is not an option, or do you think that they're just playing to our establishment? And how do we how I don't believe in electoral politics, but for those who do, I don't know how they can hold those politicians to account once they're elected.
If you look at what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and I think Ilhan Omar and Bernie Sanders signed on to this letter saying that military aid to Israel should be conditional on ending the occupation or its treatment of Palestinians. And they're getting a lot of praise for that right now. And if you look at back in the early 90s, that is what George Herbert Walker Bush said too. That was his position. Mm-hmm. And so, it shows how far to the right things have shifted in this country, how impossible it is to criticize Israel in our political system. And as you said, so many of, these progressive politicians that are kind of hailed as this new left that's going to, change the paradigm and shake things up, they end up kowtowing to the establishment. And it's always on foreign policy, so-called foreign policy issues, whether it's Palestine or whether, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez deferring to the party leadership on the coup in Venezuela. Yeah. This kind of stuff where it's just
caucus.
Yeah, is it that's right. Is it possible to have a consistent principled platform if you're going to be in U.S. politics? Either we're dealing with, it's either that politics just attracts people who have career ambitions and they're willing to sacrifice that, or they get to Washington and they see you have to play the game. If you want to actually get anything done, you have to play the game. In which case, you've already lost.
Jesse and I have talked about this many times. We didn't elect these people to go in there and call Pelosi Mama Bear. I want them to go in there and flip tables. I'm ready for them to go in there and cause chaos.
Exactly.
So the fact that, these politicians like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, that's exactly who I was thinking of when I asked this question, and Bernie Sanders too. Right. But they run on this platform and they dupe all these people into thinking that they, have progressive interests at heart. And the minute they're elected, they're walking that back. And so it's just been incredibly frustrating to watch people continually get duped by these people and never really holding them accountable, because that's the best we can do. And so, that's just been incredibly frustrating to watch.
Yeah, I mean, when I look at the Sanders campaign, I wish he had just gone like Trump, gone insane and just called out everyone. And it's they weren't going to let him be president. If he actually got to the point of he's the Democratic nominee, something would have happened. Either they would have come up with some technical reason to get rid of him, or he would have, mysteriously slipped on a banana peel, something. There's no way that they would have let him be president. And, knowing that, why wouldn't he just go after everything? And I think it's call out what a horribly corrupt institution, an anti-democratic institution the DNC is. Mm-hmm. Why wouldn't the disinformation campaigns that were waged against him? But I think people project their hopes onto these figures. That frankly, if you look at their histories, I mean, Bernie Sanders was a deeply flawed, to put it nicely, a deeply flawed candidate. Mm-hmm. That's not to say I wouldn't have been happy if he were president versus Donald Trump or Joe Biden. I would have preferred Bernie Sanders, of course.
Right.
But, I mean, I don't think electoral politics, I'm not against using electoral politics to advance goals, but, definitely in this system, it's not the be-all, end-all, and it's not the long-term answer. And, I think people get way too wrapped up in them, and it actually, I mean, it's really crazy to see how divided, the like so-called left gets between like there's like the Bernie people and the Tulsi people, and the Bernie people hate the Tulsi people, and it's just like, what is this about? Like, are you so invested?
I have to say that was one of the most annoying things about the primary season, was watching the Tulsi people and the Bernie people fight each other. It was so annoying.
Like, I'm not that wrapped up. I don't believe in any single candidate that much. There were things I liked about Bernie, and there were things I liked about Tulsi, and and it's like Tulsi had a better, stronger grasp of foreign policy, even if it's flawed.
And she actually went after the Democratic Party some.
Yeah, exactly.
I would have liked for her to do it more, but she did go after them some. She did call out the corruption. I mean, she went straight at Hillary Clinton, which I loved her for it, and I retweet that tweet all the time.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I mean, the fact that the left divides itself so frequently, and gets kind of wrapped up in this cult of personality, my team's better than your team mentality, is going to be the downfall of us all. It's shooting yourself in the foot, and the left does it. The left does it. That's the only thing we're good at.
It's true. Exactly. And now, like, we wonder why we're here with looking at either like another Trump presidency, or
Joe Biden,
or Joe Biden, who like I don't think is can tie his shoes. So
really, it's between Donald Trump and whoever Joe Biden's vice president will be.
Exactly.
Joe Biden probably wears Crocs at this point, like
or those little Velcro.
Yeah, Velcro. So I actually, that brings up a good point. I think something to dovetail into. What, Dan, is your take on the upcoming 2020 elections, with these? Trump is obviously going to be the Republican candidate. Biden is right now, but like you said, he probably can't tie his own shoes. So I've had this suspicion that something at the last minute, sort of like an October surprise, is going to occur, and maybe Hillary waiting in the wings is going to come flying out as the anointed savior. But I'm just curious what your overall thoughts are as far as the 2020 election and its implications on what we've been talking about with regard to Palestine.
Well, it's definitely a pretty nightmarish election season. I mean, after, I think a lot of people were hopeful about Bernie Sanders' campaign, and just seeing how that, whatever momentum that people thought that had just come to a crashing halt. And then Bernie, trying to channel everything, all of his people into Biden, just unceremoniously just bowing out. It's been pretty disheartening. And then, given how easy you would think it should be to defeat Trump, especially given his handling of the coronavirus pandemic, I mean, you could just be destroying him on that. But, now we're in this whole story about, Russian Russia paying the Taliban to kill Americans, as if, which is
tired of Russia.
Right. It's just so insanely weak, and it just it's just all about punching Trump from the right. And it's like, that's not a winning strategy. It's like there are so many ways to beat Trump, and this is just not it. And so it's like, who believes this stuff? Once again, it's like the Russiagate, Ukrainegate. It's just Democratic Party elites who have more in common with Trump than like they would like to admit. And they can't challenge him on policy, so they could just go after this inane conspiracies and intelligence like operations and disinformation campaigns. And it's so bad for democracy. I mean, it just undermines people's faith in like actual democratic processes. And If Joe Biden wins, it's going to be like his campaign slogan should just be like default. I mean, it's like, that's all. And so I don't know, if they'll
just be NATO.
Yeah. I mean, we could just like have a drone for president. Like, I don't know what. I mean, and that's what Joe Biden is. He's just really a hollow shell for the deep state, or the national security establishment, the CIA, to do exactly what it wants. And so obviously that's why they prefer Biden to Trump, because Trump is a loose cannon.
And Trump, I think they also have a problem with Trump because he has no talent for subtlety. And so he says the quiet part loud all the time.
Which I love about him.
I'm generally very pessimistic. But the one silver lining of a Trump presidency is that dude has ripped the mask off.
Yeah. Exactly.
There's no pretending anymore. I mean, he just straight up tell you, we're going to go take their oil. He will he just says exactly what's happening. And I think that's the only reason they don't like him.
Oh, I agree totally. The crazy thing is they still pretend. Like, if you watch, like, Congress today was like talking about like human rights and, in Hong Kong, and like in the Trump presidency, we're still going to pretend. And it's, they still have this like phony rhetoric about like how the Donald Trump presidency, whatever, the government cares about human rights around the world. It's just so blatant and naked. But I do love Trump's blatant honesty. It's just, I mean, he doesn't understand the orthodoxy of how you run an empire. He just like wants to do what he wants to do, and he's it's like whoever's in his ear, whatever he thinks is the right decision, because he's like the big boss, and that's the way it is. I mean, in terms of any October surprise, I don't know. I don't like to get into predictions. I mean, Joe Biden is an exceptionally weak candidate, but I mean, he has major institutional support. I mean, I don't think anyone would have predicted that he would be the who the Democrats ran to this point. I mean, he looked so weak before when there was this huge field. I don't think anyone would have said it's Joe Biden to this point. So it's just like a perfect encapsulation of how rotten and just kind of dystopian our system is. And I don't like to be hopeless. I don't like to be pessimistic, but I mean, it's hard to see how anything recovers, or like, are we just in for like decades of just like circling the drain in this country? And part of it is, I think that just the left is not only is it weak in terms of putting forth candidates, but on an organizational level, there's just such a I think just people are so caught up in culture wars and in just things that don't have any like real material impact on people's lives. So it is pretty hard to be hopeful at this point about the direction of this country, regardless of who wins.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, or maybe even I can say I know that if by some fluke of physics and the cosmos that Joe Biden gets elected, nothing substantially, if anything, is going to change with regard to U.S. policy toward Israel and the Palestinians. I mean, he's basically like your textbook liberal Zionist, and so my question, I guess, is then like, what do you see any hope for the Palestinians? I've watched your film Killing Gaza, which you made with Max Blumenthal, and it's an amazing film, but the whole time I watched it, I just felt this sense of hopelessness. Like, this is not gonna get better; it's gonna get worse. And much worse than we've even seen so far. So I'm wondering, like, what your what your outlook is on that. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I didn't comment on what you asked before about Biden and Israel, Palestine. I mean, yeah, I think Biden is just going to, continue on with basically whatever Israel wants. I mean, of course, he was vice president when in 2014 when Israel carried out its massacre of 2,500 people in the Gaza Strip, including 550 children, which is what we kind of chronicled that and the aftermath in killing Gaza. And so, arguably, Biden has been worse for Palestinians than Trump.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, of course, Trump has had the Great March of Return. So it's, I mean, where there were weekly massacres for more than a year.
Yeah.
But I still don't think that actually that didn't get to the death toll of protective edge, as Israel calls it.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, the Hebrew term for that, for Operation Protective Edge, is Tzukitan, which is it's like steep cliff.
Uh-huh.
It's what it literally means. I don't know. I just imagine like driving off of a steep cliff. That's like what is. But
I wish a soldier would drive his Merkava tank off a steep cliff.
We can only hope.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think nothing is. I don't foresee anything really improving for Palestinians in the near future. I think they're, just kind of stuck, and things could certainly worsen. Though I do think Israel's kind of reached a limit of what it can actually do. I mean, it keeps, they talk about we're going to topple Hamas in Gaza. They don't actually really want to topple Hamas in Gaza, because then, the whole situation collapses. They want to keep it hovering on life support, where life is hell, but it's technically alive, just on this slow drip. But, conditions continually kind of worsen, and then there's protests, and, then the fishermen can go a little bit further, or they get a few hours more electricity a day. So it's just this like constant psychological, physical pressure cooker where life is really, I mean, it's just hell.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see things improving really until the U.S. empire is rolled back and kicked out of the region. It's not just like, I think a lot of kind of liberals who sympathize with Palestinians see it as this like separate issue from Syria or from Iran or anything else. And, it's not going to get better. The common denominator is the U.S. empire. Israel wouldn't be able to do what it's doing without the U.S. And so once the U.S. gets the hell out, then, Israel will be basically forced to confront reality.
Mm-hmm.
There's no doubt in my mind that Palestinians will continue to resist. I mean, as they have done for decades, and
as is their right to do.
Yeah, no doubt, without a doubt, is their right, and it's inspiring. I mean, seeing the protests that I filmed in the documentary, which kind of hinted at the Great March of Return. I mean, it's pretty. On one hand, it's devastating to see these because it's just a bunch of young people going out and getting shot.
Yeah.
But it's also like knowing that people are not going to just submit. They refuse to just take it lying down. And so, life will go on one way or another. But I mean, the suffering that people endure is just like beyond, what it's. It's still, I haven't been to Gaza in like about 3 years now, and it's kind of hard for me to imagine what it's like. Every time I went, I don't know, a dozen or more times, and I spent a total of about 7 months there. Every time I would go back over a 2.5 year period, it was 7 months, and every time I went back, like, you could see it on people's faces, you could see it in their eyes that, like, the conditions are worse. And my friends who I would see who couldn't leave, like, you could see, like, the psychological pressure, like, building on them. And so I'm like, how do people deal with this year after year after year? And so, I mean, for one thing, the young people, you know, leave. I mean, pretty much 95% of the people I knew in Gaza who were, like, you know, most of them were, you know, several years younger than me, in their early 20s. They all left. They're all in Europe or the US or Australia. They all left. But, you know, there are, of course, the vast majority of people can't leave. They're privileged. The ones who left are privileged more so. And so the ones who are stuck there, they're just, I don't know. I don't know how they remain hopeful, but, you know, there's always this level of defiance. That's one thing about Gaza. There's, like, even though it's, like, the worst conditions, there's defiance. And, you know, even there's defiance in the West Bank. There's defiance in Jerusalem, even with a very fractured political leadership. You know, in 2017, when Israel tried to impose these metal detectors on the Al-Aqsa compound, I mean, there was massive unarmed resistance, this huge spontaneous mobilization of Palestinian society that they hadn't seen for decades, really since the first Intifada, is what everyone said. And so knowing that kind of that's always, like, in the background, that's always, you know, that potential is always there. There's some, I suppose.
I will say that something that gives me hope. You spoke earlier about how, you know, Israel has taken a massive shift to the right. We spoke then about how the United States has taken a massive shift to the right. And I am generally pessimistic, but at the same time that we're seeing that, we're also seeing kind of a global solidarity movement arise. Like, you see Black Lives Matter standing up for Palestinian rights, and indigenous communities are standing up for, you know, Black Lives Matter. And so it's kind of, it seems to be sort of a race to who's going to win, the fascists or the left. And it's kind of like this simultaneous push from both sides. So although you're right, it does look pretty grim, especially in the short term. There's a little part of me that wants to hold on to this tiny bit of hope that there is, like, kind of a global solidarity movement kind of being birthed from all of this that seems to be picking up steam.
I think there's consciousness, but, you know, consciousness has to, like, translate to action. And, you know, until there's some way to really effectively challenge the U.S. empire, then consciousness only does so much. I mean, it's obviously a necessary ingredient, but, you know, like, some way the U.S. has to be, like, rolled back out of there. You know, the main line from the U.S. to Israel, that military aid has to be cut back, has to be cut off. And frankly, it's better for not only for Palestinians, but, you know, for Israelis who live there too, to not live in this siege mentality.
Right.
I mean, it's like, even Israelis I know, you know, who I worked with on the documentary I'm working on right now, that I hired, they're in this siege mentality, and they, you know, they're not all fanatics. Some, you know, they like to travel and do this and that. They can't escape the siege mentality of, you know, I have to live in this, like, we need apartheid to protect us. And so, yeah, I mean, the U.S. has to be defeated, or some internal political movement has to roll it back. And that's, like, the only way I think things are going to improve.
Yeah.
Do you think that Bernie Sanders' 10% cut of the military budget will be it?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. So the soldiers will fire 9 bullets at one person instead of 10.
Yeah.
That's
actually,
the biggest thing I've seen.
Actually fire bullets. The Palestinians walk into them. So.
Oh right. Yeah, they attack the bullets.
Yeah. they have those crazy arson kites too, like, nuts.
Right.
Oh goodness.
Misty, do you have a question? Because I can ask one.
No.
Anything you wanted to
Thanks
follow
for putting me on
up
the spot, dude. I don't know. Go ahead.
No, I didn't mean to do that. But Dan, you talked about this siege mentality. Why do you think it's taken such a firm hold in Israeli society? I mean, we've definitely seen, Max has been really good about documenting it. He's gone to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and, talked to 20 somethings or like teenagers in the street, and they're calling Obama a nigger. I mean, they're just flat out racist, and like I know it's gotten worse since then. It's been reported on very widely. Why do you think that's happened? Why has it gone in that direction?
Well, Zionism, not even Israel, Zionism has always been a nationalist, kind of European nationalist movement, and that its like DNA is to shift to the right. And so, all of these, like when Israel was founded, they had these like kind of golden years where they thought they were this high and mighty country, and they're having all these achievements. And then 1967, the same thing, oh, now we're expanding, and it's this like kind of messianic euphoria. And then like reality hit in 1973. They had the Yom Kippur War, and like even though like basically they lost, thousands of Israelis got killed. And so that's when like things really took a major shift to the right. And so through violence, the society degrades. And that's really when, the kind of open hate of Palestinians started to become more acceptable. You had Meir Kahane come in the he came in the early 70s, like 1971. He was like a extremist rabbi from New York, actually. I think from Flatbush.
Well, isn't that sorry to interrupt, but isn't that sort of a I don't know, I guess you would call it like a cult within Zionism now? Kahanism? Yeah.
I mean, yeah, to a degree. Kahanists are the people who say, I specifically am a follower of Rabbi Kahane and everything. They are, I wouldn't even say they're a cult. Within Zionism, it's a movement, I guess, like the remnant of a movement. The Kahanists themselves are not extremely powerful, but the ideology of Kahane, of Meir Kahane, of extreme, violent, angry racism is totally prevalent in Israeli society today. And not only among, religious, but also among, kind of like religious Zionists, but also among like secular, traditional, Orthodox Jews in Israel. And so it's all kind of blended together. So like originally religious Zionists thought like, they thought in the classic colonial context, where it was like, we're actually doing this for the good of these Palestinians. We're helping them, because they're not really able to do these things. And Meir Kahane was like, no, we hate them and they hate us, and it's us or them, and we have to kill them all or expel them. And so that, through decades of violence, beginning in 73, like I said, that's when the kind of discourse in Israeli society started to really change. And one of the things you see if you go to like any right-wing rally in Israel today, what you hear all the time is Kahane was right. And what that is a reference to is Kahane was the first Israeli politician to openly speak of expelling all Palestinians. And, that will solve the problems. And now it's, people think he was right. He was vindicated. He was basically derided by he became a lawmaker in the 80s, and he was derided, and all the fellow lawmakers walked out of his speech in the Knesset and all this stuff. But now, Kahane was assassinated in 1990 or 1991. But I mean, Kahanism is taken over entirely, and so what used to be extreme and maybe esoteric is now just like the main. Anyone you talk, you could. It's like those videos Max did, and I did some too.
Yeah.
You're just going out. It's like just on the street on any given night. You just like talk to any kid. What do you think about Arabs? Oh, we have to kill them all.
Yep.
Like that's it. And it's just like some nice looking like cute kid or something. And it's just. I mean, it's.
I think Abby Martin's done some videos about that too.
Yeah, that was me. I was with Abby when we did those.
For you?
Yeah, and it's like those
were terrifying.
That was like a Monday night. That was like a Monday or Tuesday night, and I was like, I was producing for them, and I was like, well, we can, always just go to Zion Square and talk to kids, talk to people, and just it's genocidal maniacs everywhere. It's sad to say.
Yeah,
it is.
And yeah, it's insane. I just remember watching those videos and being shocked at, just the psychopathy that these kids basically were putting forward. Where do you, I know you don't want to make a prediction, but with regard to this at least proposed annexation, which hasn't really taken place yet, and basically is the entire West Bank, all the way to the Jordan, all the way through the Jordan Valley to the river. Do you think it'll actually take place at any point, or is it just going to be this sort of I don't know, this kind of like dangling provocative thing that never happens but is always talked or argued about?
It seems like it will take place. I think what Israel's doing to a degree is kind of testing out the waters, putting its toe in the water first to see like how some of the reactions are from, particularly from, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, EU, and I mean, I assume it's going to end up going through. But it's like you said, I don't want to speculate, but it seems like it will happen. And I don't know how fundamentally different it is than the current situation, but I think, Israeli hubris is just such a driving force, that, it's not like this is just something that Netanyahu cooked up himself. This has been this annexation plan. This has been a goal of the Israeli right wing for decades. I mean, they have, I've gone to conferences where it's like just about annexation, and it's, they have like one after the next, after the next, after the next. And so, if Netanyahu doesn't do it, he'll be discredited internally. Mm-hmm. And, so I don't know how he would kind of survive that politically.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think he has no choice but to push it through somehow. Like you said, they're not prepared for it currently, but I think that there's really no avoiding it at this point. But like you said, fundamentally, it really doesn't change much. But the narrative aspect of it is always going to be an issue.
Right.
And the more that they kind of dehumanize Palestinian lives and their rights and their sovereignty, the worse it's going to get, I think, overall.
Right.
Yeah, it's amazing that they've been able to get away with it for over 7 decades now. I don't see it. I don't see how it can last much longer. But just getting back to what we were talking about with going out in public and just filming ordinary Israelis on the street, and asking their opinion about Obama or Palestinians, it brings to mind the birthright trips that are kind of like, I mean, they're not kind of like, you and Max have been very vocal about this, like they're indoctrination trips, like
I went on birthright.
Yeah, yeah. You know, like I know I read the 51 Day War, and Max mentions that in there.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, he does. It's just a tiny part.
Yeah.
But that's still going on. It's like de rigueur, and I'm just wondering how much. First of all, I'm wondering like what you think about that, as far as is it just indoctrination, which I think it is, or is there like another benevolent reason for it? And also, um, how are they able to keep doing it? Like who funds this? Who sponsors this? Who pushes this?
Birthright itself is funded by what's his name? The Canadian billionaire who owns Seagram's. Why can't I think of his name? You should watch. Max did a really incredible video piece on Birthright where he went to a mega event and confronted the guy. I mean, it's definitely just an indoctrination tour.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty fun when you're 19 years old and you don't, have any political thoughts. When I went, I was about as critical as you can get while still being like, yeah, I'll go. But my whole thing was like, I will only go if I go to the West Bank afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And swim in an Israeli settlement. And see like what it's like for Palestinians. And that's what I did. And that was like a very radicalizing event for me. I spent like 3 weeks, going around the West Bank, and like to refugee camps and this and that, and seeing what apartheid looks like. And so, in that case, I don't have a huge problem with going if you're just going to use it to do that. It's 98% of people who go on it don't. And I don't think there's really anything benevolent about it. It's just an indoctrination kind of like sex tour where it's like seriously, they encourage you to like hook up and they give you ample opportunity. And they show you around and like tell you why this is your land and why it's under threat and why you have to support Israel and why you should either move to Israel or if you don't, go back to the U.S. and make sure you support Israel.
Right.
If the like nice job you're probably going to get after college because you're like from a nice Jewish family.
Yeah.
So that's what it's about.
Yeah, and in the context of what we were talking about with interviewing people in public, I wanted to ask it for that reason, but also because it's still so prominent, and a lot of people have this idea of it as just like, oh, these are kids going on a field trip to where their ancestors came from, and there's no historical context whatsoever. It's not like, hey, they're going to visit a country that was stolen from people who used to live there, almost 1 million people who used to live there. I think it's a subject that gets undercovered but over pushed. Like it keeps happening, it's just this like indoctrination program that, doesn't end. So yeah, I think going off of that, I would want to ask you, and this is going to dovetail into something that doesn't have to do with Palestine, but has to do with Syria. The propaganda machine that Israel has built for itself. I'm just interested what your comments are on that. They seem to have perfected it, as far as like like kids get blown up on the beach, and Mark Regev comes on and like nicely explains away why it happened. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, on basically that machine they built.
I mean, the Hasbara machine, on one hand, it's pretty, I want to say like impressive how efficient it is. How they're able to like get talking points out. There's like kids, there's like dead bodies of small children on the beach, and these talking points are like immediately out for all the embassies and all the spokespeople to go on the news and say like those kids committed self-genocide. That's actually what happened. The missile was trying to avoid them. The missile was just doing what it had to do to protect the Jewish people of the world, the Jews in Florida, the Jews in Brooklyn, and Los Angeles, and those kids got in the way.
This Jew right here.
Yeah. So, I mean, when I made Killing Gaza, there's a trailer on YouTube or Vimeo, and I put it on Twitter also, where I went through. Actually, I did like 3 trailers where I just like showed how Hasbara works. Like basically, I showed how many times they accused Palestinians of using each other or using their children as human shields. I mean, it was like several hundred times in the course of 51 days in 2014 that I found this accusation. So I put together this trailer with human shields, everywhere. And it's like, there's no evidence of that. There is ample evidence, as we show in the documentary. There's evidence of Israelis using Palestinians as human shields. There is testimony. There is even Israel at one point tried to pass a law legalizing the use of Palestinians as human shields.
Really?
So, yeah. So it's not even controversial.
Yeah.
But so I mean, you just see the most like sickening like propaganda talking points. They would accuse Palestinians of killing themselves, of self-genocide, of all this stuff, and it's just like the fact that this stuff airs on American television channels from MSNBC to Fox. You can just say anything about Palestinians. Mm-hmm. You can just sit there and like froth at the mouth and say they're like, they're evil people who have to be wiped off of the face of the planet. And like Jake Tapper will sit there and say, yeah, you're right. It's true. And
I'm pretty sure they used the human shield narrative, the medic that they shot in the back.
Right, exactly.
Razan, yeah. They released like an edited video where she was supposedly calling herself a human shield, and that they didn't show the full clip, and they just made it into this talking point propaganda piece, and it just went out to everybody, and it went unquestioned. Nobody questioned it.
Right.
And we see that over and over. I mean, they just did it again. The man that was shot at the checkpoint. I'm blanking. Just talked about him. Yeah. I mean, he rammed them. He was on his way to his sister's wedding. There's no reason for him to have done that on purpose.
Right.
So I mean, it's immediate. As soon as a situation happens like that, the talking points go out full force. And like you said before, I've said this to Jesse. It is impressive. Their propaganda machine is impressive. It's disgusting, but it is impressive. They have managed to completely secure the narrative surrounding their country and everything that they do. And pretty much, I mean, in most Western countries, at least, they own the United States media. So, there's no you're not allowed to be critical at all.
Right. And not only, I mean, this is all true. At the same time, their international image, it's like when you have 4 kids dead on the beach, their international image still takes a hit that no amount of propaganda can kind of explain away. And I mean, I think it's like most people see that, and it's like you can say what you want, but it's like You have so many images of like wiped out neighborhoods. It's like
I mean, the footage in Killing Gaza is it's
brutal.
In a strange way, it's beautiful, like the way it's filmed, but when you actually internalize what made the landscape look that way and that people actually still live there, people have been wiped out there, it's unbelievable. It's just yeah, it's
yeah, it's like people are just reduced to like ants. It's
yeah.
living. It's like ants in an anthill, and like some kid comes in and just like smashes it, and then they have to like rebuild their anthill, and a bunch of them die, and like it's just like that again and again and again. I mean, those neighborhoods of like Shujaiya where you saw like the big swaths of destruction, those have been like rebuilt. And they'll be the first if there's another Israeli war on Gaza. They'll be the first to be like destroyed again.
Mm-hmm.
So, I either need to get a charger or let me see. Wait a minute, okay. I got it. No, I got it. We're good. Sorry.
Take your time. All good.
We're good. My computer's about to die, but there's a charger.
Okay.
All right, go ahead.
So I wanted to ask you too about, since we were talking about propaganda, you made this short film, I guess about a year ago, maybe a little more, the Syria Deception,
right.
Which basically exposes the white helmets for what they are. And there's that really great clip at the end where you're confronting the director of Oy Vey, I'm Gay. Right. And he's like, this is bullshit from Sputnik. Like, you're showing him actual footage of an execution and white helmets running in and, just wrapping up the body and carrying it off summarily. And so I was wondering if you could talk about that, not just the war on Syria, but like this sort of like new propaganda phenomenon we've seen emerge from it, especially through the White Helmets documentary, which won an Oscar. And then, of course, there are other ones, there are other documentaries, and right. There are people, you document in that, in the Syria Deception, people, I think it's like Charles Lister, saying like Al-Qaeda's got it right in Syria, just these like insane admissions of the fact that, yeah, we're funding and equipping ISIS and jihadi elements in Syria because we want Assad gone. But if you can talk about like that extensive propaganda campaign, yeah, that would be great.
Well, I think the Oscars should have like their own they're like an award for like the genre of Syria regime change documentaries, because there have been there's 10 of them like every year, and yeah, not Cries from the White Helmets, won an Oscar. I mean, if you watch that thing, you have zero idea what's actually happening. There's no political context. You have all you know is Russian warplane. Russians are bad. Okay.
Yeah.
And the one I went after is called Cries from Syria, which is just so heavily propagandistic. And they did a screening here in DC on Capitol Hill. And so, basically the whole idea is to rally support for the dirty war on Syria. And the documentary basically kind of shows jihadis as moderate rebels. As you have, they'll be like, ISIS is bad, but then these kind of Al-Qaeda type groups, those are the moderate ones.
Right.
As if Al-Qaeda is ideologically distinct from ISIS, which it's of course not.
Or less violent.
What's that?
Or less violent.
Right. Exactly. And so, you go to this thing, and I mean, the documentary was just amazing and so bad, and so I'd watched it ahead of time, and I went in with these clips show the director, this Russian Israeli guy, who,
what's his name again?
I
We'll
remember off the top of my head.
We'll link to the video in the show notes. But
okay.
Wasn't Yevgeny? Is it Yevgeny?
Yevgeny Efanivsky.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's basically like a mercenary filmmaker. He did, as you said, I think his first big film was Oy Vey, My Son is Gay.
Yeah.
And then he did Ukraine on Fire, which is basically like the Ukraine regime change documentary propaganda flick, which portrays, fascists and neo-Nazis as like pro-democracy people, and actually it just totally omits them.
Yeah.
And so, he did the same thing for Syria. And so I went and confronted him. I basically just showed him, like, okay, this character you have, here's this person, you say they're like a neutral journalist, and here they are like hugging it out with Al-Qaeda members. And
there's that one clip
Hadi
that's
Abdullah.
very disturbing where I don't remember the journalist's name, but he's basically like crouched down with a jihadi and laughing at a Syrian soldier who's like being crushed to death in a building that's just been destroyed.
Right.
Yeah, it's
exactly. So I confronted Afanivsky with these videos, and he was just like, "This is bullshit." This is what he said. He just fakes it, and I was like, "Wait a minute. So, did you see these?" And so like basically what I understood is he had seen them and just decided to not include them because they're widely available. He's like, "Oh, I looked all over YouTube." So I was like, "Okay, so you must have come across these and just ignored them." And so he deliberately did, he can't plead ignorance. He deliberately did this propaganda film, and I'm sure was paid very handsomely for it. And so I confronted him over it, and politely, and he did not appreciate it. He kind of melted down on camera, and it was like, "Oh, this is what they say at Sputnik."
Yep.
And that was several months. Actually, I filmed that probably a year before I was even working at RT. So I mean, I released it while I was working at RT, but
right.
It had nothing to do with RT.
Right.
And so, it's just like, it just shows how, well, for one thing, incredible and insidious it is that you can have this, think tank fellow who doesn't actually know anything about the region, doesn't care to know anything about the region, being fed talking points, and his duty is to basically make Al-Qaeda palatable in Washington, which is just incredible. I mean, when I heard him say Al-Qaeda has really got it right, it was just shocking to me. We're in the Capitol building. I mean, we're like, 2 miles from the Pentagon, which got hit? Shouldn't this be like some kind of major scandal?
Yeah.
And of course it wasn't. Nobody kind of turned their head when he said that. It's just considered normal because Al-Qaeda, in national in imperial logic, Al-Qaeda good in Syria, bad in the United States. Right. So it's just so infuriating to see this stuff, and it's like anybody who, say if you're just a regular person who's not really politicized and following this stuff and engaged in Twitter on, in the minutia of if you have a family you have to take care of and a regular job,
right?
Then and you want to watch. I want to find out what's happening in Syria, and you watch any of these like 10 documentaries you can find on Netflix. All of them lead you to the same conclusion that okay, we have to regime change, and even for like a lot of liberals got on board because it's like, okay, well, all right, Trump is bad, but at least we can do something. Our military can still do something. We can we can redeem ourselves in that way. And And so, yeah, I mean, I just wanted to like kind of expose how cynical this propaganda is and deceptive, and how these extremists are being kind of promoted as moderate rebels in Western
and like
media.
you said, the people that are busy, who have like families to raise, are working 2 jobs, they can't pay their rent, they're tired. I mean, and it's not even just, documentaries or whatever, or, the mainstream media, because I think a lot of people, even if they aren't politicized, a lot of people are kind of aware that the media is full of shit. But I think that propaganda is hitting people from every direction. I mean, you have shows like Jack Ryan, through Amazon, where, it's, Russia's giving nukes to Venezuela and all this crazy.
Wait, that's not true?
Wait, I thought Hezbollah was giving
I
nukes to
am
Venezuela.
Putin's buddy. I'm Putin's buddy on Twitter, so don't talk about Putin and no.
Yeah.
But yeah, people are getting propagandized from every direction.
Right.
And it's possible to, I mean, Caitlin Johnstone wrote a great piece about, narrative control and how that's like the biggest battle that we have. And that's so true, because when people are so busy and they don't have time to, really dig in, because to find accurate information, you have to really dig in, and you have to find, legitimate sources. And you can't just, people come home from work and they flip on the TV and catch 30 minutes of MSNBC and think they're informing themselves. And that's just not the case. But yeah, the propaganda and the narrative management is such a pervasive issue. And it's kind of seems like an overwhelming monster. Like, I don't know how we combat that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think this is the way to do it to a degree, but it's like you don't always want to be in like the margins and kind of trying. I mean, I think the best we can do at this point is, to try to expose the deceptions, and just keep going after them. But I mean, it is remarkable how it's just a constant barrage from all forms of media, whether it's turning on Netflix or reading the New York Times, or
this sports game. I mean, you go to a football game and you're bombarded with military propaganda.
Right. I mean, I think this Russia Taliban story is just the perfect example of how one story planted in the New York Times just takes on a life of its own, and is suddenly like a total distraction. It's just totally taken over the media narrative, and there's hearings in Congress about it, and as we're suffering through this like massive pandemic that's only gotten worse because of our government's, I don't even say failure to handle it correctly, but outright refusal. And so it's like, it serves so many purposes, these kinds of things, but it's you really just see how incredibly efficient the U.S. propaganda machine is. But at the same time, you can also you can disrupt it, and I think that's our job. When I look at the Venezuela coup, for example, when Juan Guaido announced that he was president,
whenever I hear his name, I have to laugh.
Yeah, right.
Such a joke.
I just dove in and tried to and just research as much as I could. Who the hell is this guy? What is happening here? And Max and I ended up coming out with this piece exposing who Guaido was. That he's basically in a few words, he's like a CIA asset. He's basically trained by a CIA cutout. And that, I'd like to take some amount of credit.
He trained by? Was that the National Endowment for Democracy?
Basically, it's like an NED-funded group. It's called OPCOR.
Okay.
So
how do you spell that acronym?
OTPOR. It's not an acronym.
Okay.
It's I believe, Serbian word. And I cannot remember what it means off the top of my head, but it's in the article. You can read it at Gray Zone. It's called "The Making of Juan Guaido."
Yeah, I read it. Yeah, we'll link to that too for sure.
But to me, that was kind of the first time that I had really disrupted at least disrupted a major media narrative as it's taking place. And I think a lot of people, that gave a lot of people an understanding, framework to understand what was happening. And so it was like, wow, like I'm just some dude, and I just started researching this and came out with this thing, and like we can like fight back. Same with like the Hong Kong thing. I wrote an article about that like did well last summer, and stuff like that there are all these deceptions. And now it's like the left in general in the US, people don't believe in Juan Guaido. If you watch MSNBC, yeah, they believe in Juan Guaido, but like, people who kind of identify as leftists, they know that Juan Guaido is full of shit. And they don't really, even if, they're cynical and, want to like attack Maduro or whatever, they know that like that there was some success in disrupting that narrative. And so,
absolutely.
I think on one hand, the propaganda machine is extremely powerful, but it's also, it can be disrupted. And so that's like kind of,
that's why I always tell people to stop supporting politicians and start supporting independent journalists. That really is where like the battle line is. Like that's front lines right there is the narrative. And I mean, that's why free press and free speech has always been a huge issue for me. It's what I've kind of been fighting for Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and all that stuff. And I think that it couldn't be more obvious than it is right now that, the media is under attack, and your access to information, what you're allowed to know and what you're not allowed to know, is being decided by corporations. And so, I mean, I've been trying to convince people, stop sending Bernie Sanders $27 and send it to Max Blumenthal, or send it to Dan, or send it to Jimmy Dore, or whoever your favorite independent content creator is, or your favorite independent journalist, or whatever. That's where the front line is. And I mean, narrative control is always going to be, the biggest issue that we face.
Yep.
I totally agree. I appreciate the plug.
Yeah. Narrative control is, it's at the heart of everything that we're, people like us are, I guess you could say, fighting against, or trying to combat.
It's possible. It's any other issue, that healthcare, climate change, race, anything else you want to fight for. Those are all great issues to fight for, but you're not going to be able to do that efficiently without a free press, without access to information, without the ability to, disperse information in a real way. And so, I mean, until we can, kind of fight that battle, everything else is kind of on the back burner, or should be. It's just gotten worse. I mean, the free speech and free press have been under attack for a very long time. But in the past 20 years, it has ramped up exponentially. I mean, Obama, went after whistleblowers and journalists, and he ramped it up, and then he handed it over to Trump. And of course, now Trump is trying to prosecute Julian Assange. And I mean, look what Max went through. I mean, he had the same issue. So, I mean,
got arrested.
More people would recognize that.
Max got arrested for just simply being at the Venezuelan embassy and like filming on his phone, and then some weirdo
for delivering food.
Yeah, some weirdo made up a story about how he assaulted her or something, and I'm like,
a 60-year-old woman who claimed she was pregnant, and Max pushed her down, which was patently false. And
I don't know, Max looks like Max is pretty badass, yo. I don't know.
He seems like the most, I mean, I've never met him, but he seems like the most chill dude. I can't imagine him ever pushing.
He's great. We haven't met in person. We did an interview together, but yeah, he's a great guy. And I just, as soon as I heard that, it was obviously total bullshit. But yeah, Dan, if you just want to like quickly talk about that, what happened, because I still don't think a lot of people know with what happened at the Venezuelan embassy with the people who were occupying, and then Max. What happened to Max?
Well, when the fake Guaido administration Well, basically, the State Department decided we're going to expel the actual Venezuelan government from the embassy here and put in their little finger puppets in there, including Carlos Vecchio, the fake ambassador, former, I think, ExxonMobil lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically the actual Venezuelan government invited some local activists to defend the embassy, which is what they did. So they were in there for, I can't remember, I don't know how many days exactly, but weeks and weeks. And I went there several times, but RT basically didn't want me to stay there, to like be going in there. So they ended up not allowing me to go in, but I covered it from the outside.
Why wouldn't they allow you to go in?
I think they were sensitive to, like, they were worried about, like, if the U.S. was like, look, Russia is using its journalists, as activists to go in there.
Wow.
Which, I mean, I understand, from their perspective, but it was frustrating on a personal level.
I'm not trying to hate on RT. It's just crazy that it's gotten to that point where they have to take those precautions.
Right. So basically with, these activists inside, the government, did everything possible, along with the Venezuelan opposition, did everything possible to expel them. They had protests outside. They turned off the electricity. They turned off the water. And so, they're running out of food inside. And so Max and a handful of other people were making these deliveries of food and supplies, and it was really crazy because it was like they would try to, like, rush them past the opposition, like, thugs, and, like, throw it up to the window, or, like, the people activists in the window would, like, have, like, like a sheet that, or some way to, like, something they could tie it to raise it up. And so it was like this whole, like, bizarre kind of standoff and confrontation. And and so, meanwhile you have, like, cops and Secret Service, like, standing around, kind of totally obviously on the side of the opposition, but they couldn't, like, explicitly say it. And so eventually the cops stormed the embassy in violation of international law and arrested everyone who was still in there. And then a lengthy whole legal process just actually ended with them being, I think they got a little bit of community service, but several months after this happened, Max Blumenthal was arrested in his home. Police showed up to his house in the morning and with a warrant for his arrest, and said he was potentially armed and dangerous, which I wouldn't consider Max a dangerous person. And so there's basically no reason for that. And so they showed up and, like, basically threatened to break down his door and arrested him and brought him to jail overnight. And so I went to the hearing the next morning when he got released, and I mean, it's just total persecution of a journalist for reporting and, for basically exposing what the whole thing was about. And, it's not only about the Venezuela stuff that he's done and we've done. I mean, it's obviously a direct attack on freedom of the press. And what was really remarkable is to see how few people from the kind of professional media class said anything.
Well,
they don't speak out for Julian Assange either. They were all happy to use the leaks. The Guardian and the New York Times were happy to use the leaks to make a name for themselves. But as soon as they could turn their backs on them, they did. That's just how it is. I mean, they're self-serving. They don't really care about journalism, obviously, because they suck at it. Right. But I mean, it's really just it's all about preserving themselves more than anything, I think, which is bizarre because it's coming back to them. I mean,
it's all about access and their careers, and it's just like you see the shift of, like, people who, are happy to be propagandists and do stenography and this kind of thing. And so, it really said a lot about who spoke up for Max in that situation and who condemned that and who didn't. Just as you said, the same way, who talks about Julian Assange, the torture and persecution of Julian Assange, and, these attacks on freedom of the press. And so, fortunately, it ended up not being that bad for Max. I think it was, whatever. It was a tough night in the local jail, but, he was all right. And it was kind of probably I don't want to say good experience for him overall, but it was like very eye-opening. And I think he took a lot away from it.
Yeah. In the interviews he did about it, he really didn't even make it about himself. He talked about how, he was basically put in this huge cage with like dozens of other mostly like Black or Hispanic people,
right?
Who like couldn't make phone calls, couldn't didn't have access to bond funds. Like, we don't have habeas corpus anymore, so it's just he was in this like warehousing experience. And I think I really appreciated the fact that he focused on that and how that's also connected to fights against imperial attempts at imperial conquest, like in Venezuela. Misty and I were talking about this the other day, that we both consider ourselves anti-imperialists, but I don't think you can be an anti-imperialist without sort of like connecting the dots around the world between different social struggles and whatnot. So it was, he was arrested for, being at the Venezuelan embassy, but he was also able to bring it back to, the horrendous justice system that we have. And I don't want to we don't want to take up too much more of your time. So maybe you could just tell us about, what you're working on now. You've contributed to the Gray Zone. You were a correspondent at RT who got Elliot Abrams kind of shook on the sidewalk.
Oh yeah, he threatened me.
Yeah, I remember that. That was crazy. That was crazy.
That was one of the more memorable days of my time as an RT correspondent, is confronting Elliot Abrams on the sidewalk. That was fun. He was like, "If you don't leave me alone, I'm gonna have to." I was like, "What? You're gonna have like a death squad come after me, or what does that mean?" So now I'm just working on this like documentary series on the Israeli far right, and basically the rise of like an apocalyptic right-wing movement dedicated to the destruction of the Al-Aqsa compound. And so those years that I was in Palestine, I was following them pretty closely, and I've been really fortunate that Maffick Media, which is also in the Now, where I and Rania Khalek work,
How do you spell that? The media?
Maffick, Maffick.
Maffick?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yep. They picked up the project, and now I'm just working on that full time. And so that's I'm hoping to have that out before the end of summer. So that's what's keeping me occupied right now.
Great. Do you have any plans to go back to sort of traditional journalism, being a correspondent, or
it depends. I mean, I definitely want to go back to like regular journalism, because working on this documentary all the time, kind of takes me away from like everyday stuff going on that I'm still following, but I just can't be quite as engaged. But I mean, the reality is there is very little opportunity to do dissident journalism. So it's like there's RT, which I moved on from. And then, there's indie journalism, which is really hard to make it. It's like if you don't have a funder, then it's pretty hard. So I just got to kind of see what the future is, and see what I can do. But we'll see. To be determined.
Awesome. Do you have a title?
This is why I say support independent journalists.
Amen.
People.
Amen.
Absolutely. Yeah. Dan, do you have a Patreon account or?
Yeah, I do. It's
sorry, not users, that viewers can donate to if they feel so inclined.
I do. I'm not even sure. If you just look up Patreon Dan Cohen.
We can link it in the show notes. Dan
Cohen 3000. That's it.
Okay. Yeah, we'll link to that as well. You have a website too, correct?
Yeah, dancohenmedia.com.
Okay.
It's linked on there. So yeah, please.
And then on Twitter, you're at Dan Cohen 3000, right?
At Dan Cohen 3000.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yep.
Yeah. Definitely all viewers out there, if you're into what Dan's doing, if you think his work is important, which I unequivocally say it is, definitely follow him on Twitter. Definitely try to go back and read some of the pieces he's written, about what we talked about today and other related things. In my mind, he's one of the best independent journalists working right now. And yeah, we'll link to his website in the show notes. And
when your documentary comes out, we'd love to have you back on to talk about it.
Definitely. I look forward to it.
Yeah,
that would be great. So Dan, thank you so much for coming on, and thanks for spending almost 2 hours with us. Very generous.
Yeah,
appreciate you having me.
All right, thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Take care.